Hello everybody and welcome to a lecture on price controls. So in this lecture I'm going to be talking about the last couple of assignments in Unit 7. In these assignments you're asked to look at different graphs and different scenarios in which the government decides to mess with the equilibrium price. So sometimes this can be benefiting consumers, sometimes this can be benefiting producers, and our job in this is to kind of understand the concepts of a price ceiling and a price floor, and to analyze what happens to the market theoretically when we look at this stuff. Keep in mind that this stuff is all based on theory and it's based on static models, and so just like supply and demand, we're looking at supply and demand and price controls by the government, just assuming that everything kind of goes according to an economist's plan. And so kind of take these models with a grain of salt as far as how they apply in the real world. But as far as our assignment, it's a great place to start when you start to think about things like, well, why doesn't the government just cause us all to have a low gas price? You know, if gas prices are getting too high, they start to get into the $4 or $5 range again. Why don't they just set it at $3 and be done with it? What would happen to the market? Well, these models can kind of give us a basic idea of what might happen. So let me first talk about price ceilings. When we're talking about price ceilings and price floors, I think it's easiest to think of an upside down house. So that sounds kind of ridiculous, but in an upside down house, where is the ceiling? Well, the ceiling's on the bottom. If you look at this graph at the top here, this is an example of a price ceiling. So here we have our demand curve, downward sloping, our supply curve upward sloping. Our price ceiling is set right here. It's this solid line right there, the price ceiling. Don't be confused with this dotted line up here with the price ceiling. So the price ceiling that we're talking about here is this solid line. And so if you look at it, well, the ceiling is below the equilibrium. If you kind of glance at the next graph, it has, again, focus on the solid line. The solid line here is the price floor. It's set above the equilibrium. So that's why I kind of talk about an upside down house, because if it's a price ceiling question, you can immediately think, oh, upside down house. And that will give you all the information that you need. Then you immediately know it's below the equilibrium, and from there you can guess what's going to happen to supply and demand and ultimately to price. So let's first talk about price ceilings in regards to rent control. So in some cities, I used to live in New York, and in New York, if you were really, really lucky, you lived in an apartment in the city that was kind of grandfathered in with rent control. They did rent control quite a bit in big cities during World War II. And this was meant to try and help people out, of course, because of the Great Depression, but try and encourage people to come into the city and live. What rent control is it's setting the rent of an apartment or a home below the equilibrium or the going rate. So, you know, the going rate in New York City is anywhere from a studio apartment, essentially one big room down in the basement. One of my friends paid almost $2,000 a month for that, to you know, $4,000 or $5,000 for a really, really nice loft. So it is crazy expensive in New York if you live in the city. So that rent control, that price ceiling, could be set enough below the equilibrium that it's actually affordable for someone who isn't a stockbroker or a lawyer to afford that. So who does it benefit? Well, it benefits the consumers. But if you think about it, if it's a really low price that's being required of sellers to sell their product at, in this case rent, they're not going to want to supply as much, and so it causes kind of a problem. So let me first, before we start to analyze the graph, let me kind of explain what the demand and the supply curves represent with price controls. So with a price ceiling in this case, we're talking about rent control and housing market. The supply curve is going to be your marginal cost curve. So look at that downward sloping supply curve. In this case, it's a marginal cost curve. We're looking at the cost from the supplier's point of view. The demand curve, we can imagine, is our marginal benefit curve. So remember, when we think at the margin, we're thinking, what is the benefit that you get from producing or consuming or selling one more thing? So here we're looking in the margin, we're not looking at the whole, if that makes sense. So if the supply curve is a marginal cost curve and the demand curve is the marginal benefit curve, then that means that suppliers of the housing, which we're talking about in rent control, are going to supply houses up to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Okay, so that's those two curves, right? Supply curve is going to be our marginal cost, demand curve is marginal benefit. So we know X marks the spot. So in this example, even though the dollar amount is ridiculous, if we're talking about rent control, or rent in general in a city, this equilibrium point here, where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, whatever that is going to be what suppliers. Okay, so that equilibrium point is going to be what suppliers want to sell their product for. So when you start to mess with something like price controls, then it messes with the equilibrium. So let's look at this price ceiling. Remember, think of the upside down house. Here's the price ceiling is set below the equilibrium. Well, we should remember from Unit 4 that any price set below the equilibrium creates what? It creates a shortage. Why? Because if you look in this case, it's $2, okay? If you follow that price all the way over, the first curve that you hit is the supply curve. Okay, suppliers only want to supply two at $2 because that's such a low price. But at a low price, remember, that's what we consumers want to buy products at, a low price. So the demand is 8. So there's a shortage of 8 minus 2, which is 6. All right, so you can imagine this in the rent control scenario. If the price ceiling is set here, suppliers are not going to supply very many apartments, houses, whatever at a really low price, but the demand is really high, so it creates a housing shortage. So it actually decreases the supply of houses that are available. So now let's shift gears a little bit and look at a price floor. In this case, our price floor is going to look at something that's kind of a hot topic right now, and that's minimum wage. So in this price floor, again, think of the house as an upside down house, so the floor is going to be above the equilibrium. We're talking about this solid line here, not the dotted line, the ghost line down below, just ignore that. So in a minimum wage price floor scenario, this demand curve is going to be the employers, those people that want to hire people. Okay, so the demand is essentially for workers. The supply is labor. It's the workers. It's the employees, everyone that wants a job. So what happens with a price floor? Well, a price floor is set above the equilibrium. So in this case, we'll say the equilibrium, the minimum wage here normally, or the equilibrium wage is $5. I know that number is ridiculous right now, but let's just look at the numbers we have on the graph. Well, the minimum wage then is set higher. It's a price floor. It's set above that at $8. Theoretically, with our model, what does that create? Well, it creates a shortage of jobs because the demand is from the employer's point of view, and those employers only want to hire 2 people. But at a higher price, the supply, because it's the workers, they want to supply their labor for a higher price, and that's 8. So there's a surplus of 8 minus 2, which is 6 workers, theoretically, in our minimum wage model. So remember, this, where X marks the spot here, this is our equilibrium. Sometimes you'll get questions towards the end of this lesson in which they'll say, look at this graph and what's the equilibrium? And they'll ask for either price, which is along the vertical, or quantity, which is along the horizontal. So just make sure that you look at X marks the spot. If they're asking for price, the equilibrium price is $5. Quantity, the equilibrium quantity is 5. Then they may ask you what the surplus or the shortage is. So surplus is always above the equilibrium, okay, because suppliers want to supply their product for more than what someone is willing to pay for it. If you're going to have a price ceiling, which is below the equilibrium, there's always going to be a shortage, because remember, the demand, you want to buy something for a lower price, so the demand is much higher to lower price. Suppliers aren't going to want to supply something. And so just remember, if they ask you to analyze a graph like this, and they say, what happens at $2? What does that create? Well, you'll go from $2, pay attention to whatever curve you hit first. It's going to be the supply curve. And then you look at that number, you go over, hit your demand curve, look at that number, and you always subtract those, and that's your shortage. It's the opposite when you're looking at price floors, because it's above the equilibrium, so you're going to hit your demand curve first, a certain price. You keep going, you hit your supply curve at that price, and you simply subtract those numbers again that you see in your quantity, and that will give you your surplus of supply for a price floor. So just keep those things in mind when you're looking at this, these last few assignments. Let me know if you have any questions. It can be really confusing. Just try and go back through the lesson again, or listen to this this lecture again. And try and keep that upside down house in mind, and remember some of the rules of a price that's set below the equilibrium, creating a shortage, or above the equilibrium, creating a surplus. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Come visit me during my office hours on Thursday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. Thanks.